Thank you, Jahan. Thank you, everybody, for showing up on a cold February night in this extraordinary space. It's very good to be here with you and to see friends and people I don't know, people whose names are familiar to me, but I've never had the chance to meet in person who are here. And we thought that what we would do is this gang of friends that sat on the stage will have a bit of a chat about this book. I'll start it off by saying a few words and reading a little bit from the book, and then we'll pass it around between us. And then probably around 8:30, we'll take a break so that you lot have a chance to chat to each other and move around and stretch your limbs. And Caro and I will be at the little bookstall that we've set up here, and you'll be able to come and buy the book at that point. And then we'll kick off again when we've had a bit of a break. And in the second half, it's going to be any of you who want to ask questions to me. So it'll be me, and I think Dougie's going to chair that with me on stage. But we'll do that as a kind of Q&A with you all. As I was coming on my way here today, I took up a book which I read 20 years ago this spring. A book that one or two of you here might have heard of, called Soil and Soul. And when I finished reading this book, I sat down, and it's the only time I've ever really done this. I sat down immediately and wrote to the author, and he very kindly wrote back. And it's among the handful of books that I can say I don't know who I would be if I hadn't met this book. And I'm sure that there are other people in this room who know exactly what I'm saying with that. And it was in this book that I first heard tell of something called Gale. And I went back and reread that passage on the train today and reminded myself of a few things. And this is Alastair quoting Colin MacLeod, who's talking about this place, the project, the name. He says, we called ourselves the Gael because the Gael were the heartland people and the Gael were the strangers. And the people of the Hebrides became known as the Gael, the strange or foreign Gaels, because they assimilated Norse culture, which came down from Scandinavia. Now, as some of you know, I've come down from Scandinavia to be with you on the train from Sweden, which has been my home now for quite a while. And those of you who know your Gaelic or who are into the etymology of names may also know that the gold in Dougald is the same Gaelic syllable as the Gaul in Gale.
No.
It is. Alistair, we're going to do a test now.
You too.
Do you know?
I'm surrounded by two strangers. We better hold it together, Caro. We'll be the Heartland people.
Oh, there you go. So the do of Dougald is dark. And 2 or 3 years into this strange thing called the Dark Mountain Project that I started with a guy who's called Paul Kingsnorth, it occurred to me that of the 5 men who were most closely involved in the project, there was a Dougald, a Dougie, and a Doug. So there was a lot of darkness going around. But it feels very, very heartening to me to come here on this night for what is the first public event in the UK around this book, and the first public event anywhere since it was published, 2 days ago? And to be doing it at Gale. I mean, it's a book called At Work in the Ruins. And what that title says to me is that, the world as we knew it comes to an end. And we can't stop that. World's end, that has always been the case. But there is work to be done among the ruins. There is new life to be brought into being out of the endings of worlds. And when I sit in a place like Gale, that's not a theoretical statement to me. That is something that has been embodied by people here over years. And I've only visited once before, but I remember that first time walking in here and feeling the atmosphere of this space. And that feeling that you step into a place where the logics that dominate modern society are the logics of the state and the logic of the market. The logic of the state is, I'm doing this thing because somebody who has power over me has told me to do it and can make me do it. The logic of the market is, I'm doing this thing because someone's paying me to do it and I need money in order to pay the rent. And of course, none of us in any of the spaces that we find ourselves in or have a hand in creating can escape the power that both of those logics have over our lives. Nevertheless, there are spaces which demonstrate here and now, that exist as pockets, that show that those two logics are not the whole of the story, that human beings are capable of more than we mostly get to show when we're in spaces that are completely dominated by the logic of the market or the logic of the state. You know, we show up with what my dear friend Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who I quote a lot in this book, calls those exiled capacities, the parts of ourselves that have been sent to the edges, described as old-fashioned or obsolete, or we've been told that they never really existed, or they're just a little pretty thing that sits in the corner, and the serious business is the work of the market and the work of the state. We show up with those things and we show that people come alive. And people come alive in hard times because of that. And there are hard times around us. You don't need any of us sitting on this stage to tell you that. And there are hard times ahead of us. It's not going to get easier. But there can be hope that can be found precisely because of the way that we realize that we need each other in such times. So this is a book which is partly about climate change. But one of the things I say in the book is that, you know, climate change is only one part of the story. If the International Panel on Climate Change would call a press conference next week and say, folks, it's terribly embarrassing. We got our sums wrong. Turns out that all of that carbon dioxide, we can go on throwing it up. It's not setting the climate system out of whack at all. Would we be back in the story of progress, in a world where everything is just getting better and better? No, of course not. But sometimes the way that people talk about climate change, because it is so big and so scary, makes it sound as if it's the one big problem, that if we could just make that go away, we would be back in the kind of story of the world that folks like Steven Pinker or Hans Rosling tell us in TED Talks. And we know that that's not the case, that there is too much left out of that grand big story of progress that is sometimes still told. So the question that I put about climate change early on in the book, I sort of say, because a lot of this book is about the experiences I have had with scientists, and especially with climate scientists. I've been very lucky to get to spend time with climate scientists, not when they're stood on a stage in front of a room full of people giving a presentation, but when you sit down in the afternoon over a cup of tea and have a quiet chat and listen to what's on their hearts. And it's not that they're hiding anything from the parts of the story that they can say in the presentations that they give. But when they are in the role of scientists, there are parts of themselves as humans that role does not invite them to bring to the fore. And when you spend time with them off stage, when you talk about what's on their hearts, then you get the humanness, the vulnerability that is part of the story as well. And they are as quick as anyone to say that there are questions that climate change asks us that climate science cannot answer. And the one that I give as an example in the book is, I say, how did we find ourselves in this trouble? Was it a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry, that it turns out 7 generations down the line from the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution that all of those fossil fuels that we were using were having these unknown side effects? It's a piece of bad luck. That's one way of answering the question, how did we find ourselves at this pass? But there is another answer which speaks to me, which is to say, we found ourselves here because of a way of approaching the world, a way of seeing and treating everything and everyone that would always have brought us to such a pass, even had the atmospheric chemistry been different, that is bringing us to such a pass in many ways. And I do not just mean the many different ecological frontiers on which we are across thresholds in the way that my friends at the Stockholm Resilience Centre have explained to us so well. But there are social frontiers, cultural frontiers, where we are also far across the line into deep and damaging counterproductivity because of a way of approaching the world, a way of seeing and treating everything and everyone. So I'm going to read you one little bit from the book, and then I'm going to start to pass this around with my friends on the stage and see where the conversation up here takes us, and then later on we'll bring it into conversation with all of you. The bit that I thought I would read you, because 2 out of the 3 of the people sitting alongside me here were there at the time, is a bit that starts with the first Dark Mountain Festival that we organised in 2010 in Llangollen in Wales. And it starts with a line that I wrote one night when we were preparing for that festival. And here in this chapter, I'm being returned to that by the experience of the new climate movements that erupted in the autumn of 2018. Greta Thunberg beginning her school strike in Sweden, Extinction Rebellion taking to the streets of London. And there was something that happened in that moment that had a new voice to it, a kind of prophetic voice. And we had individuals with prophetic voices in these movements previously, but it was as if the center of gravity of the conversation and the activism around climate change had shifted to a new tone. And that reminded me of this question that I had written down a few years earlier. What do you do after you stop pretending? I'd written those words one night in early 2010 as we were preparing for the first Dark Mountain Festival. Our manifesto had seeded a cultural movement, a network of activity drawing together artists and activists, engineers and gardeners, hackers and smallholders, centered on the books we published and the gatherings we hosted. It all started with that invitation to look down, to step back from stories you no longer believe in, and activities that have become a means of distraction, a way of keeping busy enough to not have to think about what you know or fear to be the case. What still seems worth doing after you take that step? It was a question we didn't know how to answer, but which brought a new energy to conversations and spread like a rumor over the years that followed. In these new climate movements beginning in 2018, I glimpsed the outline of an activism that started from the place that question takes us, that didn't ask you to voice an optimism that you didn't feel. Much of what I saw rang true to my experiences with Dark Mountain and the strange kind of hope we had found in naming our fears and disillusionments. Only now it was spreading at large into the cultural mainstream and galvanizing people into action. You caught it in the voices of the figures who found themselves in the spotlight, Thunberg and Bradbrook, Roger Hallam and Jem Bendell. Of the 4 of them, only Bendell had a touch of the insider's smoothness, though he also sounded like a man who had reached the end of his tether, no longer willing to repeat the promises of the world of corporate social responsibility in which he had spent the previous 20 years. The others were raw and sometimes ragged. You could hear their sleepless nights in the way they spoke. And in place of rallying speeches about what we need to do, they offered prophetic imagery of a house on fire and the dark night of the soul. Not everyone was comfortable at the sight of largely white, largely middle-class crowds marching in funeral procession, watched over by the silent chorus of the red rebels in their robes and white-painted faces. These were not the people with the most to lose soonest as the climate crisis arrived. Why were we grieving over future losses when we ought to be fighting to prevent them? Well, I thought, a lot hangs on what is being mourned. the loss of creatures and landscapes for a start, so many gone and so much more destruction already written into the story, and other losses too, closer to home. At best, this public grief expressed a willingness to be bereft, to lose much that we have taken for granted, rather than fight to sustain our present ways of living, whatever the cost. I heard this from the groups I spoke to in the summer of 2019, but I remember too the words of a woman at one of those events. Her work involved helping people unpack long suppressed experiences of trauma. The first time someone starts to tell their story, she said, it matters that they get to tell it and know that they are heard. The second time, she went on, it matters that I notice when to stop them. Otherwise, the retelling can harden into an identity, a new shell to hide behind. I wondered about all those who had found in these new climate movements the space to speak the fears that they had been carrying alone. These stories too can become a shell if we miss the moment to move deeper, to find the story behind the story. I'm sitting here with people who've taught me a lot about the story behind the story and how to move deeper. And I'm sure that they have questions for me about the book or thoughts about it. But I thought I would start us off by passing over to Dougie, who I met for the first time at that Dark Mountain Festival in 2010 in Llangollen. And I'm just curious now, when you look back over those years and over the things that have happened since in climate activism and the rest of it, you know, what reflections you have now when you hear my memories of that moment.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dougald. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's in some ways the book At Work in the Ruins unpacks further some of those initial thoughts that created Dark Mountain, and it's a really, you know, the book more elegantly and eloquently than I can really articulates that ongoing, what I think is really the great existential question that we face. You know, it's like, how do we, you talk in the book about hospicing modernity, that the phrase from
Vanessa Machado de
Oliveira, and that's really what I took from those early days in encountering Dark Mountain. I'm not really a joiner of things, but I saw this manifesto and thought, I've got to go to Wales. And I was living in Galloway in a self-sufficient community at the time, and I'd read all the books on climate change. And it was a time when I guess that there was still the kind of big push, green movement, we can recycle our plastic bags and everything's going to be, it's all doable. You know, this is 12 years ago. That conversation has changed considerably. But for me at the time, I was really digging into this kind of not new, but new to me idea of the unsustainability of the path that we'd set ourselves on. And at the same time, I was living in a self-sufficient community. I had a young family. I was very much in love with the piece of land that I was on. I felt that I was living that kind of low-impact lifestyle that was going to be possible for this way ahead. But I was also juggling what for me was a kind of depression. And I don't incline towards depression. But it was a realization that this is crumbling. And at the time, it was the time of peak oil. And there was a lot of voices from the edges pretty much predicting collapse. And then along came this thing, Dark Mountain, that said, hold on a minute, let's have a bit of a deeper conversation around this. And it was, for all its kind of dark symbolism, actually, for many people, myself included, it was a moment of relief. It was like, oh, we can actually talk about this. We can be honest. And as Dougald, in the excerpt you read, you don't want to sit with that for too long, but at least to open up that conversation feels incredibly important and still is important. So that was Dark Mountain for me. It was an introduction to the idea that we can go a bit deeper than this. It's not just about the carbon count in the atmosphere. It's actually about how we move forward as a society. And again in the book, you use that lovely quote from John Michael Greer, that idea of the difference between a problem and a predicament. And a problem can be solved, But a predicament is something that you actually have to thole it. You know, that good Scottish word, to thole something. You have to endure it. And that's what we're in, folks. We're in this predicament. And it's how we move forward with that is the more interesting question than how are we going to solve the problem of climate change. So Dark Mountain for me, and the work that Dougald had been doing, the work that Paul's been doing, the ongoing work that Dougald does with his new project, A School Called Home, is about opening up the possibility of conversations that are difficult, are at times quite traumatic, because we are really digging into the hard work of being alive now. And then the flip side of it is actually acknowledging that we're also humans who enjoy the conviviality of coming together, some of the humour that Dark Mountain has kind of conjured. There was a lovely essay in one of our books called Without Gallows Humour, There's Only the Gallows. And I kind of love the idea that actually this may be a dark time in many ways, but it's also a time for opportunities and a time to come together and a time for solidarity. So I've kind of, like all of us, and over this last decade, I guess I have grown accustomed to the idea that some of those fringe ideas 12 years ago are actually now part of the mainstream conversation. And whilst I don't necessarily think that there are problems that will be easily solved, I'm heartened by the possibility that when the conversation opens up, it also opens up for ways of enduring this predicament, and that's what keeps me going. I think we all have a responsibility when you kind of get a glimpse beyond the paradigm that we're in. We all have a responsibility to keep alight that idea that there are still deep and meaningful ways of being on this planet, in this society, in these times. I don't think I've got too much more to add to that. Other than to say that one of the things that blew me away at that first festival was, and one of the things that took us all very quickly into that deeper space, was this chap here who took to the stage, and which had, it was the first festival. There was a mix of speakers, some of which really worked, some of which didn't. It was a grand experiment on Paul and Dougald's part, throwing together kind of everybody they knew to try and get this thing. And it was a remarkable thing. There was about 500 people there, 400, 500 people coming together for the first time. And I think for many of us, one of the things that blew us away was this man, Alastair McIntosh, who'd been invited to the stage to talk about his book, but sort of took it to...
About what?
I think he'd been invited on stage to talk about Soil and Soul, but you kind of took us on a bit of a shamanic journey, I seem to remember, with your poetry. So
well, I had accomplices, you see.
We had that's true, yeah.
You see, at this event in Wales, what year was that in?
2010.
2010, okay. So, I mean, there's much interesting head stuff we could talk about in this book, especially about how science is constructed and understood, not just with climate change, but also, as we've seen with COVID, especially about the limits on science. What does science claim to do? Fundamentally, I would say science claims to test realities. And what the outcomes of that is a question that goes beyond science. And one of the points you make, Dougald, is that we ask too much of science. It can tell us aspects of what is happening, or it can present hypotheses as to what is happening, but it cannot tell us what to do. And hence the difficulty climate scientists feel under when suddenly they're expected to make political statements or take stances in something that is outside of their domain. But let me come back to, and we hadn't planned this at all. I mean, you're the Dark Mountain man. Veren and I, we've just come down from a mountain, literally, today up north. And let's go back to that Dark Mountain Festival, because I turned up with two accomplices. One was a piper Ian McKinnon from Skye, the piper and academic, with a teaching post at Coventry University, but a leading scholar in Gaelic cultural identity issues. A crofter, the generations of crofting families, and a descendant of the MacCrimmons, the greatest pipers that Scotland has ever seen. He thinks only the three remaining piping descendants of the MacCrimmons. So at one point in my presentation, we had Ian appear on a kind of balcony that was running around the hall we were in with the pipes. He just let the spirits loose.
Yes.
And the other accomplice was Tom Forsyth, a crofter from Scorig, the remote peninsula south of Ullapool. And Tom was getting old by that time. He's no longer with us now. And I brought him down by train from Scotland to Wales, and it's not easy to get to Wales by train, as some of you might have experienced. And very tight connections. So, I was trying to hurry Tom hobbling along on these platforms and just making the trains on time. And we sat down, and I wanted to honor the elder. So I turned to Tom to give the opening volley in our triune presentation of Tom, me, and Ian hiding up in the gallery waiting to emerge, suitably prompted. And Tom said only a very few words that are still etched in my mind. And this is what he said. He said, "We've just travelled down here, and the experience has shown me that here you live by deadlines. Where I come from, we live by lifelines." And that was all he said, as far as I remember.
That was all he said, and everyone remembered it.
Everyone remembered it. And Dougald, you had given me one prompt when you first asked me to be here this evening, apart from being involved with Gal Gael. And I should say, incidentally, that Jehan, who introduced you, those of you who don't know, Jehan, who introduced you, it was her and her late husband, Colin MacLeod, who Dougald referenced, who are the leading lights behind the Gal Gael Trust, because it started with the motorway protest, the M77 motorway protest in the 1990s. And at the end of it, Colin and Jehan said one day, well, we've shown them what we're against, now let's show them what we're for. And that's the beginning of Gal Gael. But you asked me to say something about Tom's boat.
Yes, I did.
Because on Scorig at that time, there was the boat builder, Topher Dawson. He still builds boats, he's in Ullapool now. And Tom had a boat built by Topher, a traditional wooden boat like you'll see around Gal Gael here, a boat that you could sail or row or put an outboard motor on. But generally, Tom would use a sail. And he'd go out to remote areas where he'd cut his peat, had traditional hand cutting of peat for the fire, dry it out in the moor in the traditional way, and then he'd load it. He had an elaborate system of pulleys for getting the sacks of peat down into the boat. And then he'd set sail, and, he was telling me one day, at the time, he was having to hold the sheet, the rope, so tight that in a storm, sailing for home, that a boat came by to make sure he was okay, and he couldn't even lift a hand to wave because he was using all his strength to keep his boat in coast. But the name of that boat, and this will tie in with Caro as a Tai Chi practitioner and teacher, if I understand, is one of your things. Because the name that Tom had given his boat was Wu Wei, W-U-W-E-I, which is a Chinese Taoist concept which some of you know well what I'm talking about, called Action Through Non-Action. The idea being that if you have the right grounding in yourself, you don't need to overtly do things. Doing of things will happen in the natural course of things. But center yourself, and this is illustrated very well by Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychotherapist, whose favorite story was the Rainmaker story, a true story told to him by his friend, the German missionary scholar Richard Wilhelm, who in the 1920s was translating ancient Chinese texts, including the I Ching, which some of you will have heard of, the gold standard of the I Ching, this ancient Chinese oracle that Jung considered summed up the psychological knowledge of Chinese antiquity. So Wilhelm took pride in the fact that he was a missionary, but he never baptized a single Chinese because basically they didn't need it. He got on with learning about their scholarship. And while Wilhelm was there was a terrible drought. And the grass was dying, and the animals were starting to die. And the people knew from their history that they too would start dying. So they better try and do something about it. So first of all, they sent for the Protestant missionaries. And the Protestant missionaries came and said their very long prayers and spoke their even longer sermons. I better shut up quickly or my wife will be giving me a going over for my sermons shortly. And no rain. So then they called on the Catholic missionaries who sprinkled holy water and processed around with the Blessed Virgin Mary or whatever it was that they would do. Still no rain. So then they called for the traditional Taoist and Confucian priests who set off fireworks and fired guns into the air to frighten away the evil spirits that had caused the drought. And still no rain. A bit like, how people might be feeling with climate change in some parts of the world. And finally, interestingly, as a last resort, they called in the Rainmaker. The Rainmaker was a wizened little old man who took him 3 days to walk from a neighbouring province. When he arrived, they said, "What do you need?" He said, "I need nothing, I just need a hut to shit in." Well, I told you I'm just down from the mountain.
There we are.
It's one thing shitting in the woods, but good practice these days is that you don't do it up on mountain tops because of the nutrient balance. There's always an ecological lesson to be taught by, thank you, Uncle Freud. You see, Freud was quite jealous of Jung, and so he throws in these little slips whenever Jung gets talked about. I just need a hut to sit in. So he goes and sits in his hut, and after 3 days and 3 nights, the outer life and the inner life, an unseasonable fall of snow came, which melted to yield rain, and so the drought was relieved. So the Chinese started getting back to their business, but Richard Wilhelm, being not just any old professor, but a German professor, and a Protestant one, wanted to know what had happened. So he caught up with the Rainmaker before he left and said, "What did you do?" "I did nothing," said the Rainmaker. "Oh, come on," said Wilhelm. "Was it magic spells, incantations?" No magic spells, no incantations. "Oh, come on," said Wilhelm. "Did you just get lucky that you only had to wait 3 days before the weather changed?" "It wasn't that either," said the Rainmaker. "Well, what did you do?" said Richard Wilhelm. "Well, I'll tell you," said the Rainmaker. "When I was in my own province, my spirit was in the Tao, my spirit was in the Dharma, my spirit was in the way, the truth, the life, whatever tradition might speak to you in that sense. My soul was spiritually grounded. But when I got to this province, I found my spirit was no longer in the Dow. So that was why I asked for a hut. And it took 3 days of sitting until my soul came back into the Dow, and that was when the snow came. Now that's Wu Wei. It's a true story, but more important than the literal truth is the metaphorical truth. And the question, where does the Wu Wei lie now? Because you distinguish here between the big path and the small path. The big path, things like geoengineering and so on. And you point to things like the small path, like we're doing here in Galgale, or you talk about Sahel farmers, you talk about a conference you were at where everybody was despairing, a Jem Bendel conference, and they were all in deep gloom. And
I thought, what's going on here? I've been the doomer from Dark Mountain for so long. And this lot, and they were bureaucrats in Brussels, were more pessimistic than anyone I'd ever met at a Dark Mountain festival. And then I went and found the most hopeful man in the room. And yeah, he was working with these peasant farmers in the Sahel, and he showed me photos of them on his phone. And he pointed around the room and he said, what do they think? Do they think people are just going to give up? Caro, you are one of the people I have learned most about. You know, I first heard of Wu Wei in this strange book that I read 20 years ago. That was my introduction to it, and it was one of the things that landed in me from reading the book as an approach to all kinds of things in life. But you're probably the person who I have spent most time talking about all of this with.
The thing that can't be talked about.
Talking about the thing that literally cannot be talked about. That's like the first rule of Taoism Club is you can't
talk about the Tao. So we've blown
over
it.
to you.
And anyway, who wants to talk to a lady in a kaftan talking about Eastern philosophy? Not me, but the crazy collapsitarians who I spend time with are the most convivial people I ever met, you included. There's a couple more here. So unlike these people, I came late to Dark Mountain, although very early to Wu Wei, which I probably came across when I was about 12 in a potter's studio in Bournemouth, where I'm from. So I'm half Scottish, half English. And I spend my time between the countries running up and down seeing relatives. But when I first encountered people doing Tai Chi, I think I might have been 13. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It often looks like people directing traffic, so that's not Tai Chi. When it's good, what you've got is another version of Wu Wei. My Tai Chi master and I have a competition about who can write the best definition of Wu Wei. It's been going on for 22 years, and no one has declared a winner yet, but the one that came back to mind this morning was uncontrived action. And I thought, well, what will I talk about tonight? Dougald's asked me to talk about the thing you mustn't talk about. It's like that game where you're not allowed to use a word to describe the thing that you're desperate to use that word for. But then I remembered the difference between a convivial response, and I mean a response to everything. Your really annoying uncle, climate change, having to be evicted from your home with 3 months' notice and not knowing where to go, or half your belongings burning in smoke and having to move your boat and leave the river, which has just happened to me. The same response is the only one that seems to work and not leave a massive residue, which is doing that thing that must be done without a forceful mind. So you meet a lot of ecologists, and I meet a lot of artists and Tai Chi people trying to push each other over. And they've all got interesting techniques and methods. But when it comes to art or love or farming or working with the weather or fishing and sailing, you've got to do it without a forceful mind. You might have to use your biceps extremely forcefully, but if your mind is in the wrong place, which is why I have a problem, for instance, with how George Monbiot writes about solutionism, it is, to me, doesn't matter what the words are. What I hear behind it is a forceful mind. So if I stand up now and shout these words about Wu Wei at you, you'll just remember some numpty on the stage. If the thing you want to achieve, when the thing I want to achieve, I do it with a forceful mind, even if it looks like I won, it comes back at me. And I've done, I suppose, 25 years Tai Chi. I've had tens of thousands of pushes from really big blokes that I don't want to push hands with. And the first 10 years, it feels like a bit of an assault course. And then the second 10 years, it's like, that's interesting. That thing that was just really upsetting me day after day when he would push me, or she would push me, feels a bit different. It's not exactly nice. In fact, it's quite horrible still, but in a really interesting way. And then the last 5 years, I'm actually going into class and seeking out that bloke and that woman who I don't like pushing with, because I've got to that point where I've put down my forceful mind and I don't need to win. They've put down their forceful mind because here I am still coming to be next to them. And something changes. The problem hasn't gone away. Climate change isn't going away. Big Pete from Tai Chi isn't going away. He's younger than me, bigger than me, stronger than me, and wears a lot of aftershave, and I still have to stand in front of that. But now I don't curse him in my mind when I do it. So I feel the same about the big problems as I do with the little problems, that over time, by relaxing something, I can't tell you what that thing is, you have to find it yourself, but the big problems remain big, but it's all about my relationship to them changes. And I've watched your relationship to things changed. And I have to tell you that, an aside, Dougie's the best storyteller I know. So I'm only sitting here with you guys because this guy weaves a web with song and story. And I was drawn into this environmental area of life, not because of facts and figures, not even fear. I was ignoring it all on a boat on the Thames, having a very nice time. It was the myths and the stories, and you told them without a forceful mind. And so I was just drawn in. Being drawn into this bunch of people as a kind of slight outsider, not from your background, and not from literature, and not from science, has been really interesting, because there's one thing I've been able to bring as a present, because I've had so much that I've received, mainly friendship. I really care about taking care of how we are while things are hard. So my Tai Chi school in Scotland, I don't teach here anymore, I'm on sabbatical, but people struggled. You get hit. Your teacher runs towards you with a sword. It's really scary. But slowly, bit by bit, we settle something and come into relationship with each other. A little bit more difficulty each time. And I know that this comes across to you and to Paul and to the friends. So, it's a pleasure to be amongst people who are not trying to find the easy way, but are also not trying to force a false answer on us all. So that, for your book, for me, was the Wu way of talking about difficult things. And the reason it landed well in my heart was because you did it without a forceful mind.
Thank you, Caro. I could sit here with these three people and talk for at least 30 hours more. Dougie mentioned that I, together with my dear Anna, who is at home right now in Sweden with our 7-year-old boy, Alfie, looking after him for 3 weeks while I'm on the road, bless her. We have a school called Home. It's a funny kind of school. We've been at it for 5 years and we're still learning how to be this school. There are folks in this room who I've grown to know very well, mostly through time spent on Zoom in one of the manifestations of that school. But Anna and I always say it's a school that starts from the conversations that we bring together around our kitchen table. And I don't have to tell you that I'm sitting here with 3 of my teachers, but we have just sat here and shared with you a little of what that conversation around the kitchen table feels like. and the capacity that it has, what kind of vessel it is, what kinds of different experiences and stories it has room for, the strange connections between pushing hands and Jung and climate change and the 10,000 things that have already been named in this conversation. What I'm going to suggest we do now is that we actually take a break for, let's say, 25 minutes, so up to 9 o'clock. We'll take a break so that you all have chance. I hope that everyone who's here gets to speak to someone you've not met before in the course of this break. That's my challenge for you. Caro is going to help me very kindly to run the bookstall over here. So if you'd like to, you can come and buy a copy of the book now. It says £22 on the back, but to keep things simple, we'll say it's 20. And then we'll regather, but what we'll take half an hour coming back together at 9 o'clock, where Dougie's going to chair, and we'll take questions from you, and I will do my best to answer your questions in that bit of time. Does that sound good? Thank you, you three, for being here with me.
Pleasure.
Thank you, all of you. Well, thank you for all of the conviviality that I can feel in this space. Dougie's going to chair these questions in a moment, but I thought just to get us, to land us back into the book, I would read a very short bit, which was...
A bit more conviviality.
Oh, a bit more conviviality. A convivial cup of tea has arrived at the stage for me. Thank you. Thank you, Jahan. So... this is a very short bit, but it's the bit that Alastair said to me when he read an early rough draft of the book, that if there was anything I felt called to write more about, he would encourage me to write more about this. So maybe this will be where my next book starts from. And it's a little bit about surrender and certainty. Around the time the 2018 climate movements emerged, I began to notice a dark certainty in some of the voices speaking to us about the existential threat of climate change. I'd been talking about surrender, and I suspect that these speakers would see themselves as unillusioned, surrendering to what we know and what we have good grounds to fear about the depth of the trouble we are in, abandoning the vanity of imagining that we can take control of and manage the processes of this living earth. Yet what I hear is that note of certainty, of knowing how the story ends. And this feels like the last thing they are holding on to, that stands in the way of what surrender could mean. So my encouragement would be to surrender, yes, but to surrender to the mystery, not the certainty. Set a place at the table for the stranger who might arrive at your door, even now, even in a world which has forgotten so much about hospitality. So that's really the invitation at the end of the book, is to go forward with all that we know and all that we have good grounds to fear, but without pretending, without finding some strange dark security in thinking we know how all of this is going to end. There is a mystery here. Dougie.
Yeah, and I just want to say one of the lovely things about kind of knowing and witnessing some of Dougald's work, the projects that he's been involved in, and one of the things he often said is that he started projects to avoid writing the book that he really knew he ought to write, and he's now finally written that book. So I would urge you to grab yourself a copy if you don't get the chance. It sounds like there's more coming. It's like there's now going to be this explosion of writing, but one of the things that really strikes me, particularly through my involvement with Dark Mountain, but witnessing Dougald's work, is that word conviviality. It's come up a few times this evening, and he, I'm not going to overpraise you, but he's a very wonderful bringer together of people and ideas, and there's a real energy around that kind of ideas, and there's an excitement around that. And one of the lovely things that we often found at Dark Mountain events is that we'd set up this programme of what we thought were some shit-hot speakers and events, but actually what everybody talked about afterwards was the conversation around the fire, partly sparked perhaps by some of those speakers, but actually it was just about the bringing together people, throwing some ideas out there, and then letting that kind of compost and the juice of that conversation. So we're going to attempt, I guess, in the next half hour, just to throw out to you guys that you might have some thoughts, you might have some questions, and Dougald will do his best to answer those questions or not, because we don't always have the answers. But is anybody burning to share a question or anything? And do feel free, don't be shy.
And have we got a microphone that's going to go around? Yes,
good,
wonderful.
Yeah, fantastic. Aha. He's the first brave soul.
The one who's going to burst the dam, and then they're all going to come pouring out. And please do introduce yourself. Say your name when you stand up and speak.
That's great. We can get to the pub early.
Hi, my name's Simone. I'm trying to speak in a way that doesn't sound like I'm bringing the wrong sort of intentional energy in, because I've got a tendency to sound very enthusiastic and forceful, but I'm not. I'm not coming from that vibe at all. I was thinking there were lots of things that my mind goes everywhere, by the way, when I bring things together, but it'll be fine. I was thinking there were lots of references, particularly about that first iteration of Dark Mountain and it being experimental and stuff. And what I've been thinking a lot about in terms of creative practice is the role of improvisation in all of this, and how I've always understood improvisation in a very sort of traditional way, in the sense that it's reaching for what you have to hand to sort of create something, which I quite like that. But also I was reading about improvisation as being something that a sort of choice that you put out into the world and then responding to what comes back. And I don't really know enough about improvisation, but I just kind of feel there's a real role that improvisation can play as an artistic form in this, and I just wondered if you'd speak to that, because I'm grappling with it and I don't know what to do with it.
Thank you, Simone. You don't know this, but you've picked one of my favourite words. I love the word improvisation, because if you take it apart, it literally means acting without the ability to see ahead, which is really what we're all doing all of the time anyway. You know, we don't travel through history looking ahead into the future. We travel a bit like the famous image of the angel of history that Walter Benjamin wrote about, where the angel is being blown backwards on this storm, and he says this storm is what we call progress. And it's a very dark vision, but I've always thought that there is a less dark version of that image of traveling through time with our eyes turned towards what has already gone, which comes to me from Keith Johnstone, who is, you know, if you want one book to find your way into the territory of improvisation, whether or not it's theatre improvisation you're working with, because actually, you know, he's a teacher of a similar kind to Caro for me. He's somebody who is bringing deep, hard-to-word truths through a embodied practice, in his case, comedy improvisation, theatre improvisation. But in his book, Improvisation and the Theatre, he says when you're improvising a story, you should be like a person walking backwards, not worrying too much about what's coming there because you can't see it, but looking for the moment where you can pick something up from earlier on and weave it back in. And he says in that moment when you do that, you and the audience will have the most satisfying feeling of the whole performance. And he leaves it there as a mystery, but I think that I have one possible explanation for that powerful feeling we get, you know, when a comedian does that thing that they do called the callback towards the end of the show. And I think it's that it weaves together linear and cyclical time, by bringing something from earlier in the story back in. And I think that the experience of meaning has a lot to do with that. Because modernity has often treated the past as if it is completely gone, as if it doesn't matter, as if it's a graveyard of abandoned, earlier, cruder versions of the way that we happen to be living around here now. Whereas when we bring something from earlier in the story back in, we say, no, the past matters. In a strange way, the past continues to show up and have consequences. And that is what redeems us from a sense of meaninglessness, because the truth is we all know that we're not headed into the future. We're here for a little while, and sooner or later our little boat is going to drift off into the stream to join the ancestors. We're headed into the past. So if the past doesn't matter, we don't matter. But when we have those experiences where something from earlier in the story gets woven back in, it's a little beautiful manifestation of giving the lie to that simple linear story of time and saying, no, the past is all around us. The past is here, coiled around our feet. We trip over it if we're not careful, but we can also find that moment where you can reach out and pull something in and weave it in. And at the very end of the book, I give a back of an envelope list of 4 kinds of tasks that might be worth looking for in an age of endings. And it's an unfinished list. I'm sure there are people here who could add to it, but it's what I've got for now. And I say the first task is to salvage the good things that we have a chance of taking with us from the era that is ending, because there are things we would not gladly lose of the achievements of modernity for all its shadow sides. So salvage the good things. The second one is to mourn the good things that we're not going to be able to take with us. And as an act of mourning, and you know this if you have been through grief, if you've been through mourning, a very important part of the work of mourning is to tell the stories of what you're mourning. And those stories we can take with us, and they may turn out to be seeds in worlds that none of us can imagine yet. The third kind of task is to notice the things that were never as good as we told each other they were about the ways we have been living around here lately, and the chance that we're given in a time of endings to let go of those, to walk away, to stop mistaking the particular institutional forms which have had a monopoly on deep social goods like learning or health around here lately, for all that we are longing for when we speak about learning or health. And the fourth kind of task is to look for the dropped threads from earlier in the story. The things that have been categorized as obsolete, as inefficient, as old-fashioned, as already in the history books, but are actually surviving below the radar and at the edges, and that might make all the difference to our ability to make lives worth living in the times to come. And I sit here looking at that boat back there, and I feel like I didn't need to say that last part at all, because it is already manifest in the space that we're sitting in. Thank you for that question, Simone. I promise all the answers won't be that long.
Does anyone else want to share anything? A question or a thought? There's lots of ideas bubbling around, but there's Tessa.
Hi, I'm Tessa. I've been part of Dougald's sort of extended group from a school called Home for a couple of years now. So it's great to be here and among people that I know on screen, people that I know in person, and other people who are being drawn to this. So I'm formulating something here in my mind which isn't quite coherent yet, so bear with me. Today, and it sort of came from having listened to the opening of Dougald's book, because I've got it on audiobook at the moment, and then a bit later in the day hearing a sort of rather outraged BBC journalist talking to a member of one of the RMT branches and accusing them of having as a sort of stated purpose within their particular branch the downfall of capitalism. Which, number one is, I think most of us would probably agree that that's quite a good purpose. But number two, we don't have to bring it about because it's bringing it about of itself. But it led me to think about all those kind of groups that I'd been in, you know, decades ago, where the whole purpose of what we were there to do was was bring the end of capitalism, or bring on the revolution, because we were so clear about what was going to come next. Of course, we weren't. And the other thing that brought to mind, so listening to the beginning of Dougal's book, which is First There Must Be an End. So I think the call to action there is not to hasten the end, but to sort of observe it and sit with it and be ready for it. The other thing, of course, that brought to mind was the sort of fundamental American Christians who talk about, being raptured up to heaven. Again, that kind of idea that if we bring the end upon ourselves, something better will come. I don't think either of those things are true in case of here, but I think there's a danger that, some of us might be accused of, oh, you want to just bring everything around without knowing what's coming afterwards. And I think we need to be really, I don't know, how would you respond to that if somebody, Dougald, if somebody said to you, oh, you just want to bring everything, pull everything down and without knowing what's coming next?
I'd say, shh, don't tell everyone. No, we've already named her several times, one of the people who we've been learning a lot from in our school and who shows up in the book is Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who also writes as Vanessa Andreotti, a Brazilian indigenous thinker and scholar and activist who's based in Canada. And she talks about hospicing modernity. She wrote a book called Hospicing Modernity, and what I like about that is that it is neither trying to save it, nor is it trying to bring it down, tear it down, rush into what's coming next. It's attending to it and participating in its ending within and around us. She always says what we're talking about is not some out there, them. It's within and around us, and we're participating in hospicing modernity. So in allowing it a good ending, allowing it to pass on the lessons that it has for us, the parts of what made it the special time in human history that it has been, that we would not gladly leave behind. Making a legacy, let's say. But she says as well, alongside the work of hospicing, there's also the work of assisting with the birth of something new, as yet unknown, and possibly, but not necessarily, wiser. And doing that without suffocating it with our projections of what we want it or expect it to look like. Being ready, there's a lot of talk about hope in this book, which is strange given that it starts by taking as given that we're living in the end of the world as we know it. But Ivan Illich, who was I never met him, but I have worked with a number of his friends, and I think of him as one of my great teachers. I first came across his name in Soil and Soul, so it's all Alastair's fault. But he would say, you know what hope means? Hope means remaining open to surprise, rather than thinking that you know how the story ends. And so that might be part of this twin work of attempting kindly to give a good ending to what is ending, and to minimize the damage in its ending by taking care of each other. And at the same time to be, showing them what we're for, by knowing all of the flaws, knowing that we're not creating some perfect thing that is off the grid and not implicated in all of the shit that's going on in the world. Nonetheless, be creating pockets, spaces like this, and there are many others of them around the world, that embody, that you step into, you invite people into, and they experience a sense that we can show up with parts of ourselves that haven't been welcome in many of the workplaces, schools, institutions, families that we have lived our lives in. And that's where you find the seeds and the clues for that world that is the unknown world that is coming after the end of the world as we know it. Thanks, Tessa.
There's relative to that, there's this, there's a question coming, but I was reading the other day Stein's law. Herbert Stein was a 20th century economist, and he had this incredibly complex theory for economics, which goes something along the lines of everything that has a beginning will end. And it's this really simple truism, but then there's a corollary to it, which is known as Davies' corollary, which is things that come to an end often take much longer than you think to end. And I love that, and it's kind of true. It's like, a decade ago, we were maybe thinking, it was around the corner, but actually modernity is still with us, and we're still grappling with it. And I like that idea of that kindness, and because in our lifetime, most of us in this room, most of us will continue to grapple with this problem in our lifetime, I think, because it's coming to an end, but it's like the beginning of the end rather than the end, so that's what we're seeing through, I think, certainly in my lifetime. But over to you.
Thanks very much. Chris from Dunoon, so we may have to run very shortly, so we're not walking out for any other reason than necessity. I just want to thank you again for just those words of hope as much as anything. For those of us that remember the Green Consumer Guide from the 80s and 90s, I'm getting on in years these days, and how we kind of we looked for hope in consumerism and in plastic bags, as you mentioned earlier, and all those battles that we thought would somehow make a difference. I feel like myself surrounded by people who are broken by the lack of hope and the feeling that we have no solutions, we only have these dire warnings. So I deeply appreciate the things that you've said, but I'm also going to ask you for more. So in particular, I'd love to hear where recently have you seen or heard or experienced the seeds of that hope for whatever is going to come.
I tell a story in the book of a question that I had from a young man who said to me, how do you sustain any kind of hope without just feeling foolish in the face of the size and the sheer force of what we're up against? And listening to him took me back to what Alastair wrote about Wu Wei from Tom Forsyth in Soil and Soul spoke to me so powerfully when I was 25. And the answer that I found myself coming to, which is not the only one that I could give, was I was reminded of Karl Polanyi, the economic historian, who wrote a very important book in the 1940s called The Great Transformation, which is about the beginnings of modern industrial society and modern industrial capitalism primarily in England, but affecting lots of other places. In the late 18th and early 19th century. And one of the sound bites that Polanyi is famous for in the book is he says, laissez-faire was planned. So the kind of the neoliberalism of its time, the first wave of radical economic liberalism that was destroying communities and the fabric of society, had this story about itself that this is just natural laws. This is just what happens when you get the state out of the way. And this is demonstrably nonsense historically. It was actually a top-down project to use law and use the power of Parliament and the state to tear apart communities in the name of profit and in the name of this ideology. But Polanyi then says what then happens is a double movement where that top-down thing is going on. And simultaneously, in response to the damage that it is doing, people who do not agree with each other and do not have a single shared ideology, do not have a single shared class background in the way that the Marxist analysis would tend to suggest, improvise on the ground, starting from where they find themselves, solutions to take care of people among the damage that is being done by this force of the market that has been deliberately let rip. And out of that, slowly, close to the ground institutions are created. People learn from each other. The cooperative movement takes root. And eventually, somewhere down the line, that's where you get the seeds of social democracy in the 20th century. But the reason that comes to mind for me is because what you have there is two different layers of action taking place simultaneously. It's not that one's true and the other's false. They're both happening. And in the same way, in the book, I talk about the big path, which scares me, and which I think there is a danger now that, in good faith, out of how scared we are and out of certain ways of thinking, certain kinds of rationality, things that are going to be presented to us as climate solutions that lead further down that big path and lead us, they won't solve the mess we're in, and they will lead us deeper into dystopia. And frankly, billionaires will make a lot of money out of presenting things in those terms in the next years. But meanwhile, the small path, which is not a single path, it's many paths being walked beyond the attempt to sustain the trajectories of modernity. You know, those trajectories are going to be intensifying and falling apart at the same time, because that's how it works. It's like running an engine faster and faster. It is going faster and faster. It's also starting to fly apart. That's what we're already living through. That's what we're seeing in our societies. And meanwhile, my dear friend Liz Slade, who sends her love to you, Alastair. She's the chief officer of the Unitarians. She brought together a gang of people on Wednesday for a conversation starting with the book. And they called the conversation Infrastructures of Care in a World Beyond Modernity. How are we going to look after each other? And they had Richard Smith, who was the former editor of the British Medical Journal, and they had people from the civil service and from the NHS, and they also had, I insisted on this, my aunt, who used to be a probation officer in County Durham, and now in her retirement they've made her a badge that says Chaos Coordinator. Because she's working with her local church and a community organisation that they've set up. They're providing food banks and warm spaces, and they're getting people in complex situations of crisis dumped at their doorstep by the police and by the authorities because the system is not coping anymore. And she said to me when she was reading the book, she realised that she was carrying an anger about that, and that she was absolutely right to be angry, but that there is no way that we're going in which we're not going to have to be doing more of improvising these systems of care from below to fill the gaps being left by the systems of the market and the state. And that's not fair, but we start from where we find ourselves rather than where we'd like to start from. And I take hope in talking to my aunt about the stuff that she and her neighbours and her friends from church are doing in small mining towns in County Durham. That's where I find my hope.
Well said, Dougald. We are getting towards the end. I think it's after 9:30. There's a question?
Take one more question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tessie, and what you're talking about, stories getting stuck before that really, really hit me. And I think there has been, like you said, in 2015, that was a big part of the identity. And we've seen this, with other groups emerging, Just Stop Oil, I'd say that as well. We're very much stuck in the searing, soaring kind of pain and the crisis and anxiety. And I've been thinking for a long time where's the wisdom in the movements? Where are the wise adults that can recognize this pain and help us hold this collectively? And then when you were saying before, tending to it, and I think that's really, really important. So I've been involved in climate for a long time. I'm sure many people in this room have been. And for me, climate change used to start to smell like death. I used to smell death when I woke up. I used to smell death when I went to bed. And I realized I needed to meet death and I needed to tend for that. So my way of doing that during lockdown, I became an undertaker. I became a body washer for the co-op funeral care home. And we were dealing with 60 bodies a day. It was the middle of pandemic, deaths had doubled in the UK. And it was beautiful. And I learned a practice of processing death, not being scared of it, not drowning in it, not consuming me, but processing it. And I've been thinking a lot about how we enable communities to process this loss, right? We live in an era of loss. We live in an era of loss that spans back hundreds of years from colonialism, imperialism, the tearing down of forests, the right to be free, the right to be emancipated for everyone, right? We live in an era of loss, and that's what activism is. You're tending to loss, whatever that looks like. I held a community lament, and Glasgow were part of, they helped devise that. And that was looking at how do we lament our losses and also rooting in communities who are most impacted, communities are most closest to the pain, working class communities, and how do we create a space for people who work in housing associations, food banks, you know, where they're allowed to be angry, they're allowed to be joyous, but when the door closes, it's them that's alone at night, you know, shedding a tear, for migrant justice groups. And it was really beautiful, and it was clumsy, and it was, you know, it was an exploration of how do we hold this collectively. And I'd like to hear if you've got any thoughts around about how do we bring these kind of wise and holding spaces back in our communities as things get more wild.
Well, firstly, thank you for sharing all of that, and I'm so glad to have heard your story. In the early chapters of the book, I say more than half seriously that I started writing this book because I found that I could no longer talk about climate change after many years in which that was something that I had been deeply associated with. And I heard myself saying to my dear friend Felix, maybe it's time to stop talking about climate change. And at the end of the book, because I have said that at the beginning, I come back to it and I say, you know, where else might be a good place for us to start from in our conversations? And I say, you know, maybe loss and longing, those two things. So not just loss, but also longing, because longing involves both the sense of what we don't have, the sense of lack, but also the sense of being drawn towards. And I've been I've been realizing recently, a friend of mine, an anthropologist called Susanna Crockford, interviewed me for a book that she's writing, and she was asking me about activism, and I was saying, you know, I don't identify as an activist, not because I am in any way hostile to activism, but because, you know, I was in Stockholm last month, the day before she interviewed me. I met with Vandana Shiva and Greta Thunberg. They are activists. Alastair is an activist. These are people who put their bodies on the line. I have had the privilege of knowing a lot of those kind of people, and maybe sometimes even being some help to them. But they have a courage that I do not have, and they're playing a different role, so that's why I don't carry that identity of being an activist for myself. But. There we go. It's getting late into the evening because I had a trail of thought that I was going to follow there, that I lost in my... Alastair's... no, I know what it was. Alastair, you put up your hand and I put up my hand and I realised, yes, I know what it was. In that conversation with Susanna Crockford, it was brought home to me how shaped I was by growing up around churches and by the language, the prophetic language, the language of the Old Testament, the language of the Lord's Prayer. And I'm not saying this to attempt to convert anybody or turn this into a prayer meeting, but it has come home to me now in middle age that I became the person I am because I was in the presence throughout my childhood of a language which held a gap between, you know, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. And that gap is a gap of longing. We long to get a little closer. And if I've been able to see and say certain things that have been helpful to people, I realise belatedly now how important that upbringing and the language of the hymns and the Bible that I grew up with have been informing me as someone who does not take it for granted that the world as it is all it could ever be. Who does not take it for granted that the story we're told of what humans are like and what the world is like is the limit. That we are more than this. And that is a mystery to me. I do not, there's no plan. We're not going to make a plan for how we get to be more than this. That's part of how modernity led us astray. I had a wonderful Islamic philosopher whose name I cannot remember just now, but he was speaking at the Black Elephant Lectures in Paris a couple of weeks ago. And there's a video of it on YouTube. And he says this thing that gets called the Anthropocene, I think maybe we should call it the Secularocene. That actually its deep roots lie in some very strange way of thinking and working with the matter of belief. We don't get out of believing. We're believing creatures. That's what we're like. But we did something very strange with it in modernity. He says, we tried to create heaven on earth. We tried to put the weight of being heaven on the earth. The earth did not ask to carry that weight. It is too heavy for it. And that now is the crisis that we are at, is that we have to find a way beyond that well-intentioned project of putting the whole weight of being heaven on the earth, because the earth is sighing and weeping and moaning under the weight of our attempt to make it be heaven. There is another way of weaving together earth and heaven that might help us find a way through this deep trouble that we're in.
Thanks so much, Dougald. Therein begins another huge conversation. It's been really lovely to hear some of your thoughts behind the book and to share more about it. I'll just say on behalf of Dougald and I and Caro and Alastair, thanks so much to the Gal Gael and Jehan and all the gang here, and to the Centre for Human Ecology and Luke and Svenja and all the gang and the Enough Collective, a real collaborative effort to put this evening together. Thank you so much to all of you for coming out tonight on this cold February evening. And thanks again, Dougald, for it's been just so lovely to be here to begin the launch and the tour of the book. So yeah, well done everyone, and well done to all of you for coming. Thanks very much. And if you still want to buy a copy, Dougald will be here for a wee bit. Do come up to the table and grab a copy. You won't be disappointed.